are going to jump into Proverbs chapter 11. I hope that was a refreshing way to kind of launch our night together. And as we do, as I said prior, we're going to focus on the verses that I put in bold. Steve over here asked me how I chose those ones, and I really do just feel like in quiet moments of just reading this and praying that these are some of the verses that I feel like God put on my heart. So I hope it's a blessing to you to do it this way. People have already pointed out how repetitive Proverbs is. And full disclosure, I feel like sometimes I wake up and I read Proverbs and I'm just annoyed, if I'm honest. I'm annoyed with the repetition, and I kind of want to just be like, I get it. You guys ever been there before? Like, I get it. I get that X, Y, and Z is a bad choice, and it's not wise, and you already said it 400 times when we're only in chapter 11. I get it. And then the next day I can wake up and I can think, like, thank God. Literally, thank you, God, for the repetition, because I need the repetition. And I think it's cool that the repetition doesn't come verbatim the exact same way. It comes like just half a degree different, and it kind of you're kind of looking in at wisdom from all different angles. So I think it's a wonderful way. So my hope tonight is that as we dive into this, we're going to pause and have some table discussions. What does it mean for us in 2024? How many of you know that we need wisdom in our culture? Yeah, we do. And it doesn't matter which proverb we're in, there's all kinds of things that are relevant. And so let's dive in, and we're going to find out some of those topics. So let's talk about institutionalized cheating, which Proverbs has already decided multiple thousands of years ago that there will be people that will intentionally try to cheat others without them knowing it. Can you believe that one human would do that to another? This is what chapter 11, the first verse says, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." Abomination is reserved in the Old Testament. It's a word that means something that's detestable, something morally bankrupt, something that's like morally disgusting. It's repulsive. And so what is repulsive to the Lord? A false balance. What is a false balance? It's a scale, yeah. So this is what I want you to imagine. In the ancient world, there's all kinds of scales. They were all tuned for different things. So for instance, there could be a gold to grain scale. And it could be set that I'll take your 3 gold coins and put it on this side, and then I'm going to stack up the grain on this side until it evens out, and that's how much it buys. So we can imagine the scale. So what is the idea of a false scale?
It misreads the contents.
Yeah. And the insinuation is that if you own the scale, you're the one cheating. So you're not giving your things away. You're actually maybe upcharging, right? And so the idea is that you're cheating people, and you're cheating them intentionally. We actually have something in our society for this. It's called the Office of Weights and Measures. You probably don't even realize it's there, but one place you go often actually gets a visit from these people pretty regularly. Where's that? Gas station. You actually see the seal on there and the date signed off. And what do? I actually have seen it twice in my life. They have their special truck with all the equipment. They pull up and they put the gas in and they pull the trigger just like everyone else. But their truck is telling them how much gas is actually going in. And it has to equal what it says. Because how easy would it be for a gas station to just say, I'm going to sell 3/4 of a gallon and program the machine to say it's a whole gallon. Yeah, they could do that. So there's actually an office that makes sure that doesn't happen. So this is what Proverb 11, verse 1 is talking about. It's people who would intentionally falsify their scales. Now here's the problem. I want you to think about this. Everything in the ancient world is localized. And I want you to imagine, when we say localized, let's just think about the New Testament, because I think that's kind of an image that many of us understand a little better. What is the world that Jesus lives in? What are the towns? What are they like? What do you guys know about them? Cities, towns, villages, what are they? Okay, they're more villages. Their majority of them are kind of like semi-connected villages of probably more like hundreds in population. So we'll just say like 500, okay? These people are Jewish. They go to worship together. They pilgrim They do pilgrimages to Jerusalem together. 500 people. How many of you know 500 people? Okay, maybe not well, but you're loosely affiliated with them, right? This is the image I want you to get. If you're living in this town and somebody cheats on the scale, people are going to know, but how about the person cheating? What kind of mental gymnastics do they have to go through? Would you say it takes a little bit more chutzpah to cheat a village of 500 people that you all know? It is an intentional choice to rob your own kin, more or less. How many of you know that there is a level of depravity, a desire for wealth or privilege or whatever it might be, where people do this? He says yes. I agree with him. So here's the other thing. This is another element of it. The book of Leviticus. How many of you, honestly, I want to actually know, how many of you have read Leviticus? Okay. I've read it a couple times, but I would be lying if I didn't tell you I've done that 1-year Bible track many times, and when I get to Leviticus, I'm like, it's hard to read. But I do want to encourage you, this is a sidebar. If you start reading the New Testament, like let's just say you dive into the Gospel of John with us on Sundays, if you go back and read Leviticus, you will be blown away how many connections there actually are. Like, for instance, do you know that it's against the law for a rabbi to touch a leper? He would have to have undergone all sorts of ceremonial washings and cleanings. Why? Because the leper's uncleanness transfers to the rabbi. So when Jesus heals a leper, do you know what the first thing he does before he speaks is? With all the people who know the law, what's the first thing he does? He touches her. And touches him. Instead of his uncleanness transferring to Jesus, Jesus' holiness transfers to him, right? So these are things that give us some, but here's what I'm getting at. Leviticus, this is chapter 19, if you want to look it up. The Torah literally says that it is abhorrent before God for Jews to have unfair scales when they're measuring out their grains and things to their brothers and sisters. So it's not just like, hey, this is not wise. This is literally against the law. How many of you know of people who will break the law for selfish gain? Yeah. This is an age-old issue that's been happening for all time. So God detests the falsehood, the unfairness, the stacking the deck, cheating others for the sake of selfish gain. As much as he detests and abhors that, what does it say, the second part of verse 1? It says, but a just weight is his delight. He delights in the one who just does their everyday life with integrity and character. I think so often we're raised in a culture where we want to go viral. We want to do the big giant thing. What is this saying? It's saying the person who leaves every day with their lunch pail packed and says, you know what, I'm going to put in an honest, hard day's work. I'm going to do it with integrity and character. You are God's delight. So here's the question. We're not going to do it in a table discussion. We'll write some things on the board. We don't use literal scales that often, although I was at the grocery store this morning, and there is, tucked away in the corner, a little digital scale if you want to measure out your cashews or whatever it might be. We don't use that a lot. But where do you see unjust weights and balances being used in our world? How about we start there? Where do you see things that are unjustly balanced? You could say whatever you want. YouTube doesn't know what your voice is. I'm the one writing it out. So say whatever you want, please. College admissions. Okay. Now I would say this could be controversial pretty quick, but I think, Steve, you are actually a college professor, so you're probably more... Okay, ready? Here's the cut line on the edit. Thank you for this contribution, sir. What else? The what? Oh, courts. Yeah. Whether we like it or not, there's been a lot of research done on certain crimes and who gets harsher punishments. That's true. That's a real thing. What else? Hiring practices. Okay. Maybe a couple more? Okay. Call it immigration. Okay, so here's the point. We're not going to go issue by issue. Here's the point. How many of you are like, if we had an hour, we could just keep writing things? Is that true? The reason is because sin infects people to want to pursue selfish gain for all sorts of reasons. And so what do people do? They stack the deck in their favor. They manipulate things to benefit themselves and not others. Maybe it's to kind of play a bigger role in a narrative that they want to push. Whatever it is, we could just do this all day. We could say like, whether you want to go like left or right politics or that's not your thing, we could just pick these things out all day. But here's the more important question. When it comes to these sorts of things, we have no problem naming them. But what are Christians supposed to do? What is a Christian's role in saying that scale is not just, God is not for that scale, and I want to invite you or speak life back into God delights in just honest dealings with people? Maybe think of your own business place. Is it complex and complicated? Are there different personalities you have to deal with? And some are challenging, some are easy for you? Sometimes we read the news or we watch the news and we're told like, this is the solution, but it's always like very narrow without the nuance of like real people. So what are Christians to do? How are we supposed to operate? How about we just pick an issue? How about we do this? Let's just talk about courts. Okay, so you could find out that there is petty theft happening in your community, okay? And you find out that there is, and this is just honest truth because this is real, there is oftentimes a racial disparity in who gets their hand slapped the hardest, okay? We don't have to go into the politics of it all. What is a Christian to do or say about that? Okay, prayer. How many of you say prayer is a good start? Yeah, okay. Is that the only thing?
Don't try to shirk jury duty.
Okay, don't shirk.
Don't shirk jury duty and be committed to judging their honesty.
Oh, I'm going to do a check mark, jury duty. Okay. How many of you have ever tried to shirk jury duty before? The last time I got called, okay, so I tried to shirk it multiple times as a younger guy, and then I was kind of on the same page with you. Then Natalie gave birth to Shepard, and I get this jury duty thing, and I'm like, oh, you know, you call, and you have like a 1 in 10 chance. So I go in, but I'm like, I have a legitimate excuse for the first time, and I remember being like kind of bummed. Like I could offer the Christian perspective of what is just and what is not, but I actually, the only time I really wanted to do it, I had a legitimate excuse. So I'm giving you excuses, what I'm doing. What else? Yeah, Cecil.
Courage.
What do you mean by that?
Well, courage to you to speak up, or courage to get on the jury duty and do the right thing when you're on the jury.
Yeah. How about the courage to maybe say something that might not be like politically popular among Christians sometimes? Of like, hey, I get that maybe that person is totally ideologically opposed to everything I believe, but they're a human and they're not being treated fairly. And no matter what we think, we're supposed to be the people who say justice belongs to God and it's equal justice, and I don't see it equal. These are important conversations to have, and I think sometimes Christians either step super into certain issues or they just back away and say, oh, I'm not going to touch that with a 20-foot pole. But I think God invites us into these sorts of things. JT, did you want to say something?
No, just wanted to add to not have favoritism.
Okay, so no favoritism. I've been working really hard on, I think it's a discipline. It's when I hear something that right off the top, it's like a topic where I like recoil. Do you guys know some of these like political issues where you hear that and you're like, oh, so against that. Instead of just recoiling, saying like, tell me what you mean. Tell me why you think that. okay, so there's a little bit more nuance to it than I thought. I didn't know that about you. Oh, so that's part of your story. And engaging in real conversation, and I think over time that actually creates an avenue to talk to people instead of against that all the time. Important concept. Anybody else want to add anything? Yeah, John.
I think whatever you do, it's got to be done with the right intent, with the right intent in the heart. We can say that we're doing it in a Christian way, but are we doing it with love the way God wants us to?
Yeah, I think you could do the action that's expected of you as a Christian with the wrong heart state, and that's still sinful. I agree with that. That's an interesting thing, because sometimes we can become sheep that do the Christian thing that we're supposed to, all the while in our heart we're not actually wanting to do that as an act of worship unto God. We're wanting to do it for social acceptance or status or whatever it might be. Interesting conversation. I would encourage you to jot down any thoughts and make it a topic of conversation going forward. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to look at verses 10, 11, and 14. I'm going to erase this. Okay. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. And when the wicked perish, there are shouts of gladness. By the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted, but by the mouth of the wicked, it is overthrown. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in the abundance of counselors, there is safety. I found this quote, I think I put it in there. It's John Trapp, who was like an early 1600s Bible commentator. I think he was Church of England Anglican. He wrote, one special thing the earliest brothers prayed for the emperor was that God would send him senatum fidelum, a faithful counsel. A faithful counsel. How many of you know the power and the importance of having a faithful counsel? Yeah. How many of you have had a time where maybe you didn't have that and the choice that you thought was really wise ended up being not wise at all? Yeah. I think so often when you think of good leadership, you usually think of, in our culture, we usually think of like the one singular flag bearer who just is like powerful and almighty. But I think the very best leaders are actually people who have the humility to say, here's my expertise and I'm strong, but I also have blind spots and I'm aware of them, and I ask people and I consult people. So here's a few things just to think about. I think when it comes to righteous people, one of the things I love about when we did the study on Ephesians, how many of you are here for Ephesians? One of the things Ephesians says over and over, it says it in the negative, but this is the positive. The negative is this, is that your sin, so often in our culture we're told our sin only impacts me, right? Yeah, it's bad, yeah, it's sinful, but it only impacts me, so it's not a big deal. Ephesians tells us over and over that's not true at all. There is a spiritual component to your sin actually affects the entire community. I would say that Proverbs is saying the same thing in the positive. It's saying this, that the righteousness of people impacts the community. What does it say? When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. It's talking about people in leadership, decision-making positions. The whole city gets the overflow of the blessing. Conversely, the wicked, when they're in places of power and influence, and their influence and their power comes to an end because maybe they're removed or maybe there's death, what happens? The people celebrate. Can you think of any examples of this? I think of all those images from when the Berlin Wall came down, of finally there was a hope for a future for people who felt like there was none. Can you think of any others? Saddam Hussein? Yeah. Bin Laden, is that the other guy? Him, yeah, that guy. Yeah.
More recently in Salvador, the new president that came a few years ago started imprisoning all the gang members, having crime rate to
Lower than ours.
Yeah, and people are rejoicing.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Is anybody familiar with what Steve's talking about? If you're not in El Salvador, I think the president's name is Nayib Bukele. Yeah. Younger guy. My understanding is that he's arrested now 60,000 members of the gang MS-13. They went from the most dangerous country, I think in the entire world, right? The highest murder rate. Their murder rate in 3 years, I think, is now lower than ours. There's people who have dreamed about opening businesses but thought there's no way we could open a business. We'll be extorted. There's no way we can send our kids to walk to school, and now they go to school freely. There is rejoicing in that country. It's quite a crazy story going on. Verse 11 says this, by the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted. I think verse 11 is kind of a mini explanation of verse 10. So what does it mean that it goes well with the righteous? By the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted. I think this is the deal. I think righteous people recognize that the impact of their lives is beyond just their own life, that they're living with a moral responsibility for other people as well. And so they're focused beyond themselves. They're focused on the well-being of other places. How many of you have read the book of Jeremiah before? There's this portion. It comes, I think, in chapter 29, which is very famous, 29:11, right? For I know the plans I have for you. But there's a moment where it says that you should pray, you should seek the welfare of those in the city that you live. You should pray for the leaders. Why? Because as they make decisions, it will impact you. Pray that they would know God. Pray that they would be convicted of their sin. So often we think that person is not fit to lead. We need to remove them. And we forget that God is the miracle-working God that can turn people's hearts back to him. In the meantime, we might want to hope for that and pray for that, but we should also be praying for them as well. Otherwise, what we're doing is saying, that person is condemned and terrible. They're bringing destruction upon us. I can't wait for God to zap him with lightning or whatever, and then we can move on. So, cities are held in high esteem when men and women of righteousness lead them with integrity. The words of wicked people, people who lie, cheat, mislead, gossip, bring the reputation and the vibrance of a city down. How many of you have just followed some of the news of some of America's greatest cities are on the decline? Yeah. And we don't have to be political about it, but I think we can look in and see that, hey, some of it is maybe skimming tax money off the top. Things that were meant for beautiful things are now kind of being funneled away. Maybe decisions are being made from a selfish place instead of a place of wanting to serve and love people well. I think here's a question that comes up often. It's, who are the people who are actually running our cities? And I want to go into this a little bit. Who? I'm just going to write who. When we read the book of Proverbs, I want you to imagine that 500-person village for a second. Who do we want to elect to the council to lead the distribution after the harvest? Okay, the wisest, okay. The most honest, the most fair. Probably the guy who's never cheated on the scale before, right? Maybe there's a guy that you're like, man, every morning I wake up at 5 a.m., he's already out in the field. He's already working hard, right? He's got his eyes set on the harvest date, and he's doing everything he can to maximize it. Is that a person you would want? And in this village setting, do you know that person? You know them. What has happened in our culture? Do we know these people? Do we know them? Not personally, we don't. So what are we dependent upon? We're dependent on reputation. We're dependent on kind of an image that's been curated. How many of you know that I was mentioning, we were talking about, that they spend millions of dollars curating an image, and they have focus groups and consultants trying to figure out who is our voting base and what do we have to say or what do we have to do. One of my favorite/least favorites is when they try to pander to Christians. Have you ever seen this? And they try to quote the Bible, and it's like, as somebody who loves the Bible, it's just so cringy, and it has nothing to do with right or left because they both do it. They say oh yeah, my favorite book of the Bible, and then they pronounce a book that doesn't exist. That's not how you pronounce it. If you've been to church one time, you know that's not how you pronounce it, right? And you just cringe. Just doing that all the time. Do we know these people? We don't. We don't really know them. Here's an observation I have that I think is important. Our culture has kind of seeped into how we do our faith. I would say we have the YouTube preacher, the famous YouTube preacher. And I'm not opposed and I'm not against. Or I guess those are the same thing. I'm not for or against necessarily, but this is the problem. So often in our mind, we think somebody who has their name on a book that they wrote, somebody who has a video with 100,000 views must be credible. Because that's how our culture works. Status equals credibility in our minds. It's been formed and shaped in us. Now here's the problem. How many of you have followed anything about Christian culture in like just the last 5 years? How many of these people have had moral failures that have been like very, very devastating? And we all think like, oh, I couldn't have seen that coming. And then you hear stories or you read stories, and guess what? There was actually people who knew them, very close to them, that say, I saw it coming and I tried to warn people and nobody would listen to me, right? So do we know these people? Oh. So we live in a culture where this question of who are these people matters a great deal. And I think sometimes we buy the bait of like, whatever the TV ad told me that person is, this guy good, that guy bad. Go forward with that assumption, right? Instead of, this is a nuanced human being, and this is a nuanced human being. And I think I need to do a lot of study and a lot of reading and a lot of prayer if I'm a voting person of like, what I'm going to do with the fact that two very flawed people are running for president. We can just say it, right? How do we move forward with that? That's up to you, not up to me. But sometimes we get caught up in good versus evil all the time. Verse 14, I think this is the connection, says this. Where there is no guidance, a people falls. But in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. People, according to the Bible, are designed for the need for leadership. There is leadership structure everywhere. There is no getting away from the fact that all of us live in concentric circles where sometimes we're people being asked to be led by someone else. Sometimes we're in positions where we are supposed to lead. All in the same day. You can just think about your relationships, right? I go to work and I have a boss who I trust to lead. I go home, I'm a dad, and I'm expected to lead, right? And all these different nuanced things. We are designed for leadership. Leadership requires guidance. I would say the solo leader is not a leader you want to put your faith in. But where there is an abundance of counselors, there is safety. We could talk about all sorts of stories about great leadership and the amount of counsel, the amount of feedback that's received, but I think we get the point. So here's a question for us. What do we have on time? I think we're good on time. We'll do the same thing we did before, and then the next question will go into groups. Where have you seen institutions thrive and serve people well because of righteous leadership? And in what ways have you seen once thriving spaces come to ruin or become ruined because of the mouths of the wicked, as Proverbs says? So where have you seen things that once used to thrive with good leadership and now they're on the decline because of bad leadership? Just make another list. We're listy people. Macro. Okay, California. All right. Now, I can't get in your head and tell you what you mean. I agree, but I think there's always, as a Christian, there's always got to be hope and optimism for broken places, right? When God's people are in Babylon, like the epitome of the worst place ever, God doesn't say, ugh, stinks to be you guys. Good luck crying yourself to sleep and starving to death. That's not what he says. What does he say? Does he say, this is going to be a cakewalk? No, he says, this is going to be brutal and very hard. But I call you to be faithful even in broken places. So, California. How many of you have lived in California for 40 years or more? How many of you would say you feel like this version of California you're living in is better or worse than 40 years ago? Okay, so kind of a worse. Okay. Much worse. Okay, sounds like far worse. All of the exponentials on there. Okay, what else? What else have you seen?
Various churches.
Yeah. And what do you mean by that, Greg?
Well, take this church, for instance.
I mean, what do you mean by that, sir, who has an opinion? Mm.
So this church is very rare. It's a blessing to see Mark. His dad started it, and he's loving people, and people are loving him. So even though things have changed, there has been love throughout. And you look at other churches, and they've declined in love.
Mm.
And they've declined in, if you decline in love, even though you're doing other things, you might be faithfully teaching the Bible, but if you decline in love, your church is going to suffer. People are going to leave. Compromise people are going to get hurt.
Mm.
And you see that a lot. So I guess it's not so much of a righteous leader versus a wicked leader. It's the amount of love that's being shared, which of course is righteous. A lack of love leaves a vacuum where iniquity can come in and compromise. What you may call it when you have your skin falling off, leprosy kind of spreads.
Mm. Like what you were saying about love, as you were saying it, I was reminded of, but these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest is love. Man, you're so right. As you're saying that, I almost feel like lights are coming on. Like I've been to places that appear to be thriving, and then when you sit there, you just feel like there's like a coldness. There's like a human distance. Sometimes I feel like what it is it's like the professional Christian class who stands up there and does all the stuff, instead of the invitation to, we all have different callings, but we're all called to do this together. Do you know what I mean? I feel like as somebody who teaches, there's a temptation, and luckily there's someone in my life who's always reminded me of the temptation of being on a platform, even on a stage, can very quickly become something it was never meant to do. One of the checks that I always think is if somebody comes and says, hey, you said that and I feel like that's wrong, what is my initial reaction? Because I want it to be like, tell me. Please tell me. I don't want that. That's not always. Sometimes it's a, what do you mean? A little bit, right? But like if we just get into the nobody can correct, then we have a problem, right? When we have churches that are not equipping the saints to do the ministry, but I'm the expert, I do the ministry, and you guys get to hear about it, that's not church, right? I agree with that. It's very sad to see even beautiful buildings and architecture that was designed to draw your attention upwards towards God and say, we're going to throw money into this giant building in this neighborhood because we want you to see how beautiful the things of God are, and they're falling apart and cracking, and they're no longer central to that community at all. It's devastating in a lot of ways. Yeah, JT.
It's such an interesting comment because I was in downtown Los Angeles this morning, and what Greg was saying about the love of the church, I think it extends to the love of the city, because I don't meet very many people that love the city, that love to be there, and it's radically, 40 years has radically changed. About the love, and because I stand there and I look up at the old buildings because some of them are absolutely just gorgeous. But I think that extends. I think the whole issue of love is.
I love that you're saying this. This is his story to tell, and you can ask him, but I was just chatting with Danny. He was out yesterday because I think he said there were 17 or 19 pastors from right around here that decided to get away together to Catalina to pray just for the city. That was it. Like, what'd you do? We just prayed and asked God, like, what is your vision to help the churches, help this city thrive? And I just thought, I said, like, that's awesome. What else? That's it. Just for 8 hours. That's just like what we did. We prayed and then we talked, and then you should ask him about it. But you're totally right. It's like if the city that we're planted isn't better because we're here, then that is one of the callings that we have, right? Very, very good comment. Okay, I want to talk about pigs and gold rings because as far as culture goes, I feel like this is a place that I love to rant, and there's a lot to say. So let's look at verse 22, and this is going to end in a group discussion. This might even be where we end for the night. Like a gold ring and a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. What is this topic about? What is this about? What? I'm probably going to giggle. So this is like my favorite thing to do in the youth group. Like if people weren't sharing, you could just do this. And then all the middle school boys were like, can't even look at it. Okay, so there's a handful of things to talk about here. Number one, I want you to know this because this is funny. This is a joke. This is humorous on purpose. This is intentionally extreme so that you get the point. So let's talk about the moving pieces here. Like a gold ring. So what is a gold ring? Same now as it's always been. What is it? Value. It's something very valuable. Rings often are signs of covenants and agreements. In the ancient world, rings often signify like marriage like they do now, but they signify that families are coming together in like a bond. So now like your family has 20 acres over there and my family has 15 acres over here, and because our children are getting married, now we're agreeing that no matter what happens, we're going to look out for each other. So gold is valuable. It's important. It marks something really, a bond, a social bond that's very strong. And he says, like a gold ring in a pig's snout. Anybody here Jewish? I know, Mark, you're Jewish by blood. Jewish by blood. Anybody know anything about what Jews think about pigs? It's not just that they're not kosher, so we don't eat them, right? Not kosher. They are filthy, yep. I think Leviticus says they're filthy because they cheweth not their cud, which is interesting. They don't, as nasty as sometimes a cow appears to be, cows are actually pretty picky about what they eat. Pigs, anybody ever raised a pig, been around somebody raising a pig? What are you throwing a pig pen for them to eat? Whatever you got, anything. Do you know, this is terrible, but do you know that pigs, when they're hungry enough, will eat a human? Yeah, ooh, so there's that, yeah. Ooh. I wrote these things down. Let's see. In the 200s AD, there was this Talmudic expression. Talmud is like a commentary on the Torah. That one rabbi was saying, you know what, to avoid pigs altogether, let's not even use the Hebrew word for pig. When it comes to speak about pigs, let's use this expression. Let's just call them the other animal. Okay? In 67 BC, a rabbi wrote, not only were pigs not kosher and not to be around the people of Israel, but anyone who raised a pig already had an eternal curse on their head. Antiochus IV, I think I've told you this before, he was a Syrian Greek emperor. He wanted to outlaw Judaism, and what did he do? He burst into the temple, and what did he demand his soldiers to do? Sacrifice pigs on the altar. Okay, so pigs are detestable, they're terrible, they're beyond anything that we can imagine in our culture. They're like filth, they're the sign of absolute disgust, okay? So like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. So this is an innuendo about kind of sexual unchastity, about being kind of loose morally. And I think this is what it's saying. I think it's saying the natural beauty of a woman is a waste if it's just an adornment to something as filthy as a pig on the inside. I wrote down this quote. I'll try to say it slowly because it's a little bit deep. It says this: the misplaced ornaments, instead of enhancing her beauty, make her look foolishly wasteful, grotesque, and repulsive. Instead of gaining honor by the natural gift that God has given, she wins ridicule. This proverb instructs youth to give priority to the inner grace, not outward beauty. Interesting. This concept doesn't just go for women, it also goes for men. Remember when it comes time to pick a new king? Goes on out to Jesse's house, Samuel does, and what is he looking at? All these strapping varsity quarterback-like sons of his. And what does God tell him? I don't look at the outward appearance, I look at the heart. Okay, so we got it. So I think here's a couple things to consider. just kind of contextually. So who wrote this proverb? Is Solomon a credible person to be writing this sort of thing? Oh, there we go. Solomon, influenced by the world around him, had, let me make sure I have the numbers not swapped. Yeah. 700 wives and 300 concubines. Do these things add up? Is this a scale that's broken? Let me, I guess, this is my thinking out loud. Have you ever, well, let's depersonalize it from you so it doesn't get awkward. Have you ever known of another person who is struggling in a sin that they were having a really hard time with, but in that moment they were still able to warn other people, like, don't do this? You ever have that? I remember a youth worker when I was a young college student who was volunteering in a youth group I was volunteering in, and he used to always tell boys, like, look, I have been fighting and struggling this addiction to pornography, and I'm fighting so hard, and I have accountability. If I could tell you one thing, it's don't ever get started. Don't even entertain the idea. So we could say in this perfect world of like, well, who is he to say that? Or we could say he knows firsthand from experience how devastating this is, and he's trying to warn others. Okay, so here's my couple questions out loud for you. Do we have a sexuality and appearance problem in our culture? Where the outward appearance, we give so much value to things without ever knowing what the quote that I read, the inner graces of people. Yeah. Do we judge books by their cover? And oftentimes that cover in our culture is like how beautiful people are. Is that true? Totally. In fact, I think it was John was talking about hiring practices. I read a study that people who are like people think are more attractive are way more likely to get a job, right? Doesn't speak to competence, doesn't speak to like history or anything like that. So we have this problem. By the way, I think it's set up to be a woman in this proverb, but I think it's like the spirit of don't give in to this kind of outward sexuality in a way where you totally, completely are putting something valuable on a pig. You're throwing away something valuable into something that's not worth your time. So I just lifted this off of our Clash of the Kingdom study. This is what I had written then. Here are our cultural values that define who we are as people. Individualism, consumerism, pleasure, and uninhibited freedom. This is the I should be able to have my truth, and you should respect my truth because I'm going to respect your truth. And if you're not picking up on the sarcasm, I hate that kind of stuff. So here it is. Autonomous individual has the right to live out their truth uninhibited by anyone else. We have an expectation of speed and convenience in our culture. We can talk about Amazon and all the ways that they can get things to your door in the same day. By the way, this is a thought experiment. If Amazon sent you an email tonight and was like, hey, look, the speed and convenience thing is getting pretty out of hand, so we're going to go back to 5-day shipping. How many of you would be like, no, I can't accommodate that in my life right now. Like, I at least need next day, right? I remember when I was a kid, I was obsessed with NBA basketball. And I used to get this magazine, you might remember it, it was called East Bay. It was like all the athletic stuff. And you'd flip to the back page and you'd write your name and everything and all the item numbers. Like you'd be a page and it'd be like shoes. It'd be like 1A, 1B, 1C. You'd write what you wanted, then you'd have your mom write a check, staple it, put it in the envelope. And it would be like 4 weeks later. It'd be so long you would send this off and you'd just forget about it. And then one day, a month and a half later, you'd come home from school and your shoes would be there and you'd be like, I forgot about those. That's the world we just lived in. I'm not that old. That was 30 years ago, right? And now if those shoes aren't here tomorrow, I'm like, pretty frustrated making a phone call. Okay. We have the right to pleasure over pain. So much has been put on, the painkiller generation. Some of you know about the Sackler family and kind of the push of opioids. But why are we the culture that caught on so well to? I'm not letting them off the hook at all. I'm just saying we are a culture that says pain bad, feeling good all the time good, and so whatever it takes, whatever it's going to cost is what I'm willing to pay. Sexual conquest is seen as a sign of upward mobility, popularity, and visibility. I would say this is the sex sells. Here are some statistics. You have the statistics in front of you, right? Let's just look at a couple of these. 12% of all websites on the entire internet have pornographic material. 12%. Crazy. The biggest porn website is the fourth most trafficked website on the internet, only behind Google, YouTube, and Facebook. The average first pornographic exposure for children in the U.S. happens between 9 and 13. I don't know this for sure, but I would venture to guess that age is getting driven down. 1 in 4 of all search engine requests on the internet is pornographic in nature. So this is the world we're living in, and we can critique it all we want, but this is reality. Like right this second, we're sitting here at a Bible study, and everything I just said is happening in the culture we live in. So here's the question. The Bible speaks often of the temptation and the destruction that befalls sexual sin and the arc of cultures that bend towards overt sexuality. Do you remember when we talked about Ephesians, what their temple was all about? What was their temple? Anybody remember? What was it, Bo? Your mouth in it. Yeah, this temple prostitution as worship, right? The largest temples in the ancient world, right in Ephesus. So we are not unique. Cultures bend in this direction over time, right? Our Western culture is quickly teaching sexuality to the next generation with conviction and certainty that is often difficult for Christians to understand or even combat in a way that young people receive at all. So what I'm saying is, do we have a message and a belief system around sex and sexuality? We do. Do you know that it is not being packaged in a way that young people are receiving very well? Yeah. Young people are bad decision makers, I guess, would be a good thing. Many of them have supercomputers in their pocket, right? Access to all sorts of things at all times. They're getting these messages from peers and teachers, and oftentimes, unfortunately, Christians in their lives don't even talk about it with them. So here's the question. Why do you think Christians have such a difficult time talking about the cultural issue of sexuality and what's happening in our culture? If you were mentoring a young man or young woman, so why don't we just, for the sake of the question, if you are a woman, just assume you're mentoring a young woman, and if you're a man, assume you're mentoring a young man. What compelling wisdom from God's word would you share as a foundation for them to understand God's plan and view for sexuality? Pretty straightforward? A little heavy duty based on the vibe in the room. Why don't we take 6 or 7 minutes, and then this is where we will wrap up. So if you guys want to jump over here and join this table, you can. We'll do that, and then we'll wrap up from there. So why don't we talk about that? Man, I had a great conversation. Some incredible insights, some things I didn't consider and challenged on. Really, really good. I do want to just end really briefly. I'm going to just read these last few verses and give you a couple thoughts, and then we'll pray. I hope that this is helpful, and I hope that you hear the heart. It's so important to gather and study God's word, but this is not the ends. This is the means to the ends, which is get out there and do something about it. We all have authority. We all have leadership in different places. Maybe it's small. Maybe it's very large. But we have opportunities to speak into people's lives. Sometimes I think we think this culture is a runaway train. What am I going to do to stand on the tracks and push it back? The way that you do it is exactly how God called you to do it. It's to look into the circle God's placed you and say, God, I want to have eyes wide open. I'm going to pray. Put someone on my heart that I can encourage, that I can challenge. And then I'm going to leave up the conviction and all that stuff. That's your job. It's not my job. But I'm not going to shirk my responsibility of speaking truth that I have. And that's why we study the Bible. So verse 24 says this, the one who gives freely, one gives freely yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. We use this verse in tithing all the time. I think sometimes we do it okay, and sometimes we do it with false motives. It's like, see, look, if you just give stuff away, you're going to get more back. Anybody ever heard that message before on a documentary about a church that went sideways and crazy, turned into a cult? This is one of the places, right? Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. The people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. The idea of this idea of getting richer is not just wealth. It's holistic richness. So here's the idea. You have a lot of stuff and you give it away. Is it possible that God could bring opportunities to refill your bank account? Sure. Is it possible that he doesn't? And instead what he brings you is the richness of feeling what it feels like for a human heart to expand and give things away? Absolutely. Could that be your richness? Yes. How many of you know somebody who has very little and they're like so open-handed and so happy to give? I love that. That is the Christian message on this front, I think. Whoever brings a blessing will be enriched, and the one who waters will himself be watered. The idea is seeing like a plant that needs the provision of water for it to continue to grow. I think this is a good example as sometimes we do with our kids, or I do with my kids. You see like, oh, this is an opportunity. I don't want to squelch him. I want to give him what he needs to grow, right? And that comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of giving something of yourself. And so often when you do that, and you do that, and you do that, and you feel like, man, I didn't know I was able to give so much, I always come away with this. I expected to be more tired. God waters back into you. It turns out, like we say this, and sometimes I think these Christian phrases are like, what does that actually mean? We say like, you can't outgive God, right? And sometimes we think, oh, money? How does it mean to give God? It means that when you give love, if I'm like, man, Pat is in need of encouragement, I'm going to stay late, I'm going to pray for Pat, I'm going to talk with Pat. And usually without Christ, that's an exhausting thing to talk and process for hours with someone. And you leave and you think, I don't feel exhausted at all. Why? It's because God is the source of all love that flows through you. So God, the people curse him who holds back the grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. Here's the idea. I didn't know this. I'm not sure if I had read this before, but I read it this week. It was a very common practice, much like cheating in the scales. The other way wealthy people cheated others to become even more wealthy is they had the finance and the ability to create like grain silos. So they would harvest the grain, and if you were wealthy enough to have some ability to preserve it, you would preserve it and wait until there was no more grain on the market. And you know what happens when people are starving? They're willing to do whatever it takes. So you could mark up the grain. So what does it say? It says, the people curse him who holds back the grain. You're holding it back to drive up the price until I have no choice. But a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. This is the same concept. This is another repetition of the scales. This is the person who goes to work and says, you know what, this is what's been given to me. I'm going to treat it with justice and fairness. And I'm going to be a man or a woman of character and integrity. I'm going to go about. I have this field that's harvested. I'm going to sell the grain because I'm in the business of selling grain. I'm going to sell it fairly. I'm probably going to get a little bit of a profit out of it. And also the people are going to be served because they need grain. And God says that that is his delight, as we know. So I think here's the main theme. We say this a lot when we talk about tithing here. This is just the open-handed lifestyle. It's the lifestyle of, I trust that as I give of myself, whether it's time, my gifts and talents, my finances, I trust that God is my provider. How quickly we turn and we operate, we might think in our head, God is my provider. And then if you just watched somebody's everyday life, including mine a lot, I'm the provider, I can figure it out, I'll take care of this. And I think the invitation is not to condemn yourself, it's to walk into tomorrow more open-handed than you were today. and say, like, God, I'd love an opportunity to give of something. I heard this said, and this is where I'll end. I heard somebody, they were challenging on giving. And it wasn't on church giving, it wasn't on tithing, it was just about Christians being giving people. And he said, this speaker was saying that he often had these moments where he felt like this uptight urge, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay the bills. I don't know if there's going to be enough for a good summer vacation. Anybody ever felt that before? He said the practice that he had was in that moment, he didn't think. He didn't think, he just did this thing. He said, every time I had that, the next time I went to the gas station, I just looked at somebody pulling in and said, hey, can I buy you a tank of gas? He's like, sometimes I wanted to do it and it was my joy. Sometimes it was like, I don't want to do this. Why am I doing this? But I just felt like God had put it on my heart, just do that. And it was almost like shackles being taken off of like, welcome back to being open-handed. I feel like, man, that's a little bit of a sacrifice. Costs you something, but what a beautiful thing. God, thank you for your word tonight. And thank you that your word is not just printed words on a page that was written down and translated thousands of years ago, but it's alive, that you want it to come alive, not just in our hearts and our minds, but you want it to come alive in our bodies as we walk out of this place. So I pray that the wisdom that you have for us in the book of Proverbs wouldn't just stay on Wednesday nights in a classroom at a church, but it would spill over into the workplaces, into the friendships, into the schools that we're a part of. Would we grow in our wisdom? And as we do, as we read tonight, would people be blessed because we're there? Not because of what we've done, but what you've put in us, that we can share freely, we can speak truth even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. We can encourage and we can give out of an abundance of love that will never run dry because our roots are in you. So we love you. We ask that you would go before us into our Thursday and beyond, and that you would just give us every opportunity to walk out our faith. Amen. Amen.